How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is the next chapter from my book called Reform or Ruin. It's about the social contract. Once again, we're delving into what on earth governments are supposed to do instead of the idiotic things they do get up to. First of all, what is a social contract? In political philosophy, a social contract is an agreement between the ruled and their rulers, defining the rights and duties of each. In prehistoric times, mankind lived a largely separate existence, or else formed very small units, and presumably sorted out social problems relatively simply by gathering together to discuss them and come to some agreement on how matters should proceed. When those groups became larger and formed into city-states, there were too many people to deal with matters by a gathering together of all the people concerned, and over time, matters relating to the management of relations between individuals were given over either to a headman or a group of persons of manageable size who acted as representatives of the larger community. And from these beginnings grew the concept of kingship and government. There have been several attempts to define and redefine how a social contract should usefully operate. These attempts go back to the time of the Greek city-states. However, life has changed quite considerably since those times, and maybe the old definitions have become out of date. The next attempts at defining a social contract were made by the English philosophers Hobbes and Locke, and the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It is to be noted that times had changed considerably since the days of the Greek city-state. It would therefore seem reasonable to expect the concepts to have changed to reflect the new conditions in the body politic. Hobbes and Locke sought to justify and define the relationship between a political authority and the general populace. With a larger population, it became necessary to regulate the way people interacted with each other for the common good, and without detriment to each other. In other words, they showed why and under what conditions government is useful and ought therefore to be accepted by all reasonable people as a voluntary obligation. But of course, times have again moved on, and life has changed even more. In 1800, there were about 1 million people living in England, an incredibly small number compared to today. It was also still a largely agrarian society. The needs of such a society were vastly different from the needs of today's societies, and it means that the matters that fell into the new social contract will, of necessity, be rather different. On the one hand, I have to ask whether it's right for any government to restrict my use of a drone when I send it up in the air to take photographs of my house and garden. On the other hand, my neighbour has to ask whether it's right that I should be allowed to send up my drone and take photographs when he and his wife are sunbathing, wearing very little in their garden, when they thought they were private. And we aren't only talking about laws. The whole purpose of government in the mid-21st century bears no relationship to the situation even 100 years ago. If we look at the political parties as they are in the United Kingdom today, one has to ask how do their traditional values and outlook chime with current technology and attitudes. At the beginning of the 20th century, England had an empire that covered a quarter of the globe. 50 years earlier, the single port of Liverpool hosted no less than 40% of world trade. On a social level, there was a massive underclass that was living in abject poverty and had no parliamentary representation. This laid the grounds for the rise of the Labour Party, so-called because it represented the poorer, downtrodden working classes. The Conservative Party traditionally represented the landed gentry. Well, today we have no downtrodden working class people. We do have unfortunates, but they are not a downtrodden class needing more representation in Parliament. In fact, in a later chapter, I shall argue that the working class is a class of people that is gradually being phased out by robots and AI, artificial intelligence. Landed gentry? Not many of them about these days. Those of us who own real estate usually hold a lease on an apartment or have a mortgage on a property with a small front garden, maybe a less small back garden. Not what I would call landed gentry at all. Instead, we have a large middle class which is about to change its size and its meaning quite drastically over the course of the next decade. I shall go into that situation also in a later chapter. Again, if we go back to the year 1900, we will see that although motor cars existed, they were very few and they were far between. Electricity was also in use, but once again, very few houses were fitted with electrical circuits. Indeed, when I bought a house in Somerset at the end of the 60s, it had no bathroom. In 1900, there was no properly functioning telephone system, no radio or TV. The gramophone had only just been invented, and the sound quality of the discs, shaped like jam bottles, actually, with highly coloured pictures. I used to have some. And that consisted of quality today that we would regard as utterly appalling. There were no aeroplanes. Horse-drawn carriages filled the streets. There were certainly no tractors about. And in the countryside, 90% of the population were involved in agriculture. Even as late as the early 50s, in the village where I lived as a child, all but 3 people worked on the farms. Now hardly anybody works on the farms, as everything has been mechanized. There is even one farm in the country which is totally mechanized with no workers at all. There were no computers 100 years ago, no internet, no social networks. The sheer magnitude of the changes that have taken place over the course of the last 120 years is mind-boggling. One thing, however, hasn't kept up, and that is the mechanism of government and what it stands for. What we have seen so far in the actions of the governments the people of the United Kingdom have suffered in this opening period of the 21st century shows clearly how out of touch the current system is, and that it is time for a change to something that can deal with 21st century situations and problems. In short, the current political system is not fit for purpose. I have just listed some of the changes that have taken place in just over a century. Anybody studying biology and the technology surrounding the subject will know that the past 25 years have changed medicine out of all recognition. The development of robotics is changing life decade by decade rather than century by century. The development of computers has grown enormously in the same way. Big data, the cloud, machine learning, and more are ushering in even more changes. And I haven't yet mentioned blockchain technology, which is about to change our lives even more. We need to realize what has changed and how that has changed the way we think, work, and play, and what that is doing to the social contract. In the next chapters, I will go into these changes in more detail and try and extrapolate what that will do to our societies, and how those changes will lead to other changes which we need to prepare for now, and which our society needs to learn to cope with and learn fast, or we are going to get into a right royal mess. Earlier in this chapter, I pointed out a couple of indicators that things were heading in quite the wrong direction. Unless we're very careful, we will wake up one morning and find we have no freedoms at all. We are now at the technological stage where a decade or two will close the gates, and those of us left behind will find we no longer have choices, but are controlled by institutions which were not set up for that purpose. Governments were set up to manage the social contract, and that contract should be ensuring that a government is there simply to be responsible for maintaining a framework within which people within a society can function as they wish to function, without unduly upsetting their neighbours' ability to do the same. And it is not for government to decide what that best is. That is a matter for each member of the public. I'll go into that in a little more detail in the next chapter. For the moment, thank you for listening. See you next week.